Up to June 6, 1944, the World War in Western Europe was characterized by Nazi domination. On the day that is known as D-Day and was codenamed Operation Overlord, a new frontier was opened by the Allied forces. Those forces were the United States, Canada, France, and Britain. By invading and eventually reclaiming Western Europe, the Allies forged this new frontier by crossing the border into France. A border is one type of frontier. Another type of frontier has to do with the limits of attainment or knowledge in a subject. Clearly, this massive sea and air invasion broke the known limits by successfully pooling together elements of planning, logistics, and operations that enabled the Allies to pull off the most impressive invasion in modern warfare. It was a new frontier in international coordination and cooperation. D-Day was the turning point that marked the beginning of the end of the Third Reich's control of Western Europe.
The Second World War had begun in September 1939 with the German invasion of Poland. In June 1940, France had surrendered to Germany. The United States entered the war in December 1941. In February of 1943, the Germans surrendered at Stalingrad, which helped turn the war in favor of the Allies. Although the tide had turned for the Allies, the war was far from won, and the recapture of Western Europe was essential. Plans for an invasion of France began almost as soon as the British were defeated at Dunkirk. Sir Winston Churchill had said, "We will be back." Plans for an invasion of France were begun in 1942 with the formation of SHAEF, which stands for the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander, and General Sir Bernard Montgomery was the Commander-in-Chief responsible for the actual landings. Planning for the invasion began in 1942 with Operation Overlord. By 1943, British, Canadian, and American troops began training for Overlord anywhere that resembled the beaches of France, including the Calvert Cliffs. The 50 miles of beach were codenamed and divided up. Britain was to attack Sword and Gold, Canada would attack Juno, and the Americans took Utah and Omaha, under the leadership of General O.N. Bradley. The Germans had been preparing for the invasion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox, received the assignment of defending the coast from invasion. He constructed a defensive line known as the Atlantic Wall. He created many obstacles for the Allied troops to get through. However, many in the German high command doubted that the Allies would risk crossing the English Channel at Normandy. This doubt was encouraged by the Allies. They created many deceptions. The most famous and successful deception was codenamed Operation Fortitude. General George Patton was considered by the Germans as the most likely leader of an invasion. Patton was given command of a false army that would lead the enemy to believe that the invasion would leave from Dover and attack Pas-de-Calais. Patton's army was equipped with inflated rubber tanks, fake radio communications, phony hospitals, ammunition dumps, guns, camps, and planes all made of canvas. The largest ever buildup of troops, food, medical supplies, equipment, landing ship tanks, ships, planes, gliders, parachutes, oil and gasoline was assembled. New amphibious landing units and portable harbors called mulberries were constructed. It was the largest fleet ever assembled. The importance of intelligence gathering cannot be overstated. The French resistance aided a great deal with information. The original date set for the invasion was June 5th, but the weather was so poor that General Eisenhower debated giving the command for the 6th. This decision played an important part on the operation's success. If he had delayed another day, the invasion would have to wait almost another month for favorable tide conditions. Such a delay would give opportunities for the Germans to discover the plan or to be better prepared. The Germans were so confident that the Allies would not attempt an invasion under the prevailing conditions that they conducted scheduled war games in the north. Field Marshal Rommel went home to celebrate his wife's birthday after meeting with Hitler earlier that day. The invasion began with the drop of airborne troops on inland areas to give support to the troops landing on the beach. Many of the paratroopers, however, were dropped in the wrong places because of a low-lying cloud cover. Rommel had flooded fields and set up traps that made it almost impossible for the paratroopers to land. Many of them were not heard from again. Because the paratroopers were scattered, the Germans failed to think they were part of a larger invasion, but they helped to save many lives. The airborne troops were followed by the heaviest bombardment ever known. For a full day before the invasion, the coast was pummeled by Allied bombers. They took out bridges and other transportation routes that might bring reinforcements. The bombardment began around 3:15 a.m., with 1,000 Royal Air Force bombers blasting the invasion area with 6,000 tons of bombs. Half an hour before the troops landed, 1,365 heavy U.S. bombers dropped another 3,000 tons of explosives. 15 minutes before the landings, medium and heavy fighter bombers swept the coast. In addition, the American and British navies had ships set up as a floating artillery. They showered the beaches with the heaviest bombardment in history. Despite all of the activity, the Germans were slow to react. Word reached Rommel's chief of staff around 2:15 a.m., but he did not think it was the invasion. He did send word to Rundstedt, and at 2:55, he sent the message to Berlin. However, he was still not sure of the location of the real assault. He thought this was a diversion for the assault on Calais. About 4:15, Rundstedt decided that Normandy was the invasion site, and he called for reserves. At the same time, he sent word to Hitler's chief of staff, Colonel General Alfred Jody, who was not awakened until 6:30. He was very angry that reserves had been ordered without his approval, so he denied the order. During all of this, those Germans along the beach could look out and see the endless number of ships on the horizon. These delays were important to the Allied success. The landing was immense. There were 150,000 men, 12,000 planes, 1,500 tanks, and 5,300 ships. But when H hour came, they were all dependent on the first wave. Everything was planned to work exactly right, but when the landings began, there were many unplanned for variables as a result of the weather and the German defense. Many of the landing vehicles were swamped as the enemy, especially at Omaha, were well entrenched and had avoided damage from the bombardment. The men faced difficult conditions. They were soaked, seasick, and scared. They had to disembark, wade ashore, cross the beaches under heavy fire, and fight their way inland. The coastal defenses sprang into action, most notably at Omaha, where more than 3/4 of the men ashore were casualties. The men had to scale cliffs after crossing the beach, but most were immobilized with shock. Slowly a group here and there gathered the strength to lead the way and get a toehold on the high ground. These first small successes made it possible for larger advances. By night, the Allies had broken through and were within striking distance of Caen. The largest amphibious assault in history was a success. The Allies had smashed through the Atlantic Wall. It took 11 more months to bring the surrender of Germany, but there is no question that D-Day marked the beginning of the end.
The term D-Day is used by the military to mean the first day of an operation. In modern world history, it will always mean June 6, 1944, the invasion of Normandy. To Americans, it also means Omaha Beach, where more than 2,000 young men made the supreme sacrifice to end Hitler's attempt to create a new world order. The invasion at Normandy was the frontier that had to be opened for the liberation of France and the retaking of Western Europe. It was also a new frontier of international cooperation that allowed the world's largest combined force to defeat one of the world's largest villains. The war was far from over at the end of this longest day, but it was a turning point in history. Once the Third Reich was defeated, the Allies were able to turn their full attention to Japan and eventually end World War II, the most deadly war the world has ever seen.